Hi.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Well, thank you.
I had like such a busy afternoon and it made the day go by so fast. I was like, oh my gosh, it's 5 o'clock already.
I know that happens sometimes, right?
Yeah. It's good
Kind
though.
of nice
It's-
though.
I know. The afternoons drag on, I feel like sometimes when you're working from home, you're like, okay, it's 3 o'clock, 2 more hours.
I feel like when there's a lot of busyness in the morning, the rest of the day just kind of flies by.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice that it happens that way.
I know. And it was nice out today finally, so I got to go outside for a little bit and it's crazy.
Yeah. It's really nice though.
Yeah, when the weather isn't the best, it's awful. Like right now, it just got so gray, and I'm like, oh gosh.
Oh, yeah, it's pretty nice over here.
Yeah,
I'm pretty lucky to have nice weather this way, but I'm hoping that upstate New York has a turn of events.
I know. It's been pretty dicey up here lately.
Okay, let's see. Everything's set up. Yes. Okay, beautiful. All right. All right. Oh my gosh, so cute.
She's so needy. It's like ridiculous.
What's her name?
Dot.
Dot. Oh, that's so cute.
Yeah, she's very needy. Especially with me being home all the time now. She's like very much used to just always being held. So.
We have or my family has a black lab mix named Allie, and she's just so happy that we're here that she's trying to take up every minute of our day. Like, take me out, take me for a walk. Like, I want to go to the park, and there's some things we can't do, and some things we can, like go for a walk. But
That's how she is
tough.
now. She's like, she expects me to walk her every like hour now. And I'm like, no, I can't. I'm like, I have to work.
Yeah, it's tough.
So we can wait a few more minutes and then get started. I'll just wait like 2 more minutes just in case people have connectivity issues or anything like that. And then we can get started.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I think, yeah, it looks like everybody's muted, which is perfect. That way we don't have any interference.
Great. So glad to see some people joining. That's exciting. But yeah, I'll give some time for folks to come in and figure out their Zoom capabilities.
Exactly. Oops. Darling.
Hi. My video is working on my computer, so I was trying to figure it out, and I was like, I'm just gonna go on my phone. So.
Oh, you're fine. No worries. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's I'm in Florida, so I can't complain.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been fun. It's been nice to, have the warmth and sun, but
have you heard anything about your internship? Are you
Yeah, so it was actually yesterday I found out that it actually was moved to remote just because they don't want interns, I guess, coming on and possibly causing an issue in Congress. So yeah, it's remote for now unless DC gets a little better later in the summer, but
still a good opportunity for sure.
Yeah, it's still really great. Glad it's not. So I'm lucky for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started with those who are on the call right now. If you guys have questions as Sophie is going through her presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat box. You can either send it privately to me or share it with everybody. And then towards the end, we will be able to answer any questions that might come up. but it's just a little bit easier to have you guys type it out than try to talk like while Sophie's talking. So I will let Sophie take it away. We're very lucky to have her joining us today. So I'll let you kind of introduce yourself and everything like that. But I got a sneak peek of the webinar and it's pretty good. So I'll let you take it away.
All right, excellent. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to have some people on the webinar today. My name is Sophie Halter. I'm a graduate of the class of 2016 from Hobart and William Smith, and my professional career is in fundraising, and I started out as a grant writer, so it felt very appropriate to have a grant writing webinar, and I'm really excited to do that for you all today. So I'll be sharing my screen and having a presentation for you all so you can kind of follow along with what you're seeing on the screen. And also, if everyone could just mute themselves so there's no background noise, that would be greatly appreciated. That way we don't hear the noise in the background. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's get started. I'll share my screen with you all and we can begin the presentation. All right. Okay, so thank you all so much for coming. I'm so glad that everyone is able to join today. And as I said, my name is Sophie Halter, and I'm going to start just kind of taking everyone through some basic information and getting in the right mindset of a grant writer or a fundraiser, and then moving into some more detailed information and doing a deeper dive on grant writing. So first, I want to start off with, essentially, who are grant writers? How do we, when we think about grant writing, or when you hear the word grant writer, what do you think of? And from my professional experience, grant writers are fundraisers. By nature, grant writers in any environment, whether it's a small business, a nonprofit, an individual even. I think grant writers are fundraisers. They're focused on raising money for causes and reaching philanthropic goals. And so by nature, in my opinion, grant writers are fundraisers. And secondly, I envision, grant writers are researchers. Even in practice, when you're researching information to support the cause that you believe in, or to make a strong case to a potential funder that the cause that you support is worth giving money to, you need to find information that validates those arguments. So I like to think that grant writers are also researchers. And lastly, of course, they're writers. Grant writers have to be very persuasive and use concise, clear, and compelling language to make the case that the project they're requesting funding for, or the initiative that they want to support through funding from, any grant maker, it needs to be a strong argument. And so grant writers, of course, very, very compelling writers. And that's just, a short list of identities. But starting off on that note kind of gets you in the mindset of, who are grant writers and the different identities that they take. So I'd like to think that they're fundraisers, researchers, and writers. And so as I was creating this webinar, I started to think about, for those of you who may not know much about grant writing, and for those of you who know a lot about the fundraising world in general, the thought that I have as someone who's worked in the professional field as a grant writer and as a fundraiser, any executive or any employer or anyone who's working for a company is always focused on funding. So I reframed this question as not only where can an executive or an employer find grant writers, but where can you find funding? It's the question that everybody is asking. So to answer that question, I thought we would start off with a visual to kind of conceptualize and visualize where funding comes from, its sources, and also to understand that these sources are overlapping. So first, of course, funding comes from the government, and a lot of organizations receive funding from the government. Some organizations may receive 70, 80, 90% of their funding from government agencies. Some well-known ones are like the Department of Homeless Services or Department of Health and Wellness, or mental health and hygiene. So government has a lot of money, and that's just one, funding body. And secondly, you have corporations, big businesses, every business that we know of, whether that's, large shopping, conglomerates or stores, every organization, every company has a philanthropic arm, has some part of their business that says, we're going to separate this money, put it aside, and use it to give back to communities. So corporations always have money to give. And in addition to that, from my experience, the term institutional donors or institutional funders is a big word. So that's foundations, like your Google Foundation, your Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, and even hospitals, like NYU Langone in New York City is a very well-known hospital and also a really large donor. And then you have schools like Hobart and William Smith, receives donations from its supporters, from its students, but also can provide money back and give back to communities like Geneva. So institutional donors, also a big part of this. And then lastly, individuals. We all independently give money to causes we support. So we have funding to give. So we ourselves, we are individually funding sources. And I put this DAFs in parentheses as a fun grant writing term. DAFs in the fundraising world are donor advised funds. So those are individuals who are very wealthy or who have companies, individuals who started those companies, and they're putting aside a little pot of money to, in the future or in the present, support causes they believe in. So I'd like to kind of break fundraising into these 4 categories just as a visual to understand where funding sources are coming from. So moving forward for the rest of this webinar, I thought it would be a good idea to break up grant writing into 3 phases, kind of the before, during, and during/after phase of grant writing. First, starting off with, what should I know before writing a grant? So before you start writing a grant or looking for funding, what are the basic areas of things that you need to know before you start getting into that process? And first is the need. And I like to use this word because it's a very commonly used term in grant writing. And so the term need is like a necessity or some need in a community that you want to meet, or
Sophie?
to meet.
Can you, somehow your sound went out when you were saying the need part?
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I was just saying that the need is basically like, what is the issue you're trying to resolve, or the need that you've identified that you want to meet through a service or a program of some sort. Is that audio okay? Brianna, was that better? Okay. All right. And then next, as I mentioned, target population. So you've identified a need of a specific problem or issue that you would like to solve, a need you'd like to meet, but whose need is that? So target population in grant writing terms is also who you're serving. So getting really specific about those individuals, the race, gender, class, maybe occupation, geography of those individuals. Think about that. That is your target population. And then next, of course, is program and services. So what is the program? What is the thing you're going to design to serve that population to meet that need? So is it a text line? Is it a employment program? Are you a school and you're offering education classes? What is the program that you are going to make that will serve that target population to meet a very specific need? And then keep going down this pyramid, staffing and partnerships. So what I mean by staffing and partnerships is you're going to need support. You're going to need people to help you carry out this program to meet a certain need of a certain population. So think about counselors, full-time staff, interns, tech support. Who are the individuals that you will work with to carry out this vision you have? But in addition to that, not just your internal, personnel, your team, but also external partnerships. And that can take a variety of shapes and forms. So that may be, the government, local businesses, possibly other companies, other nonprofit organizations, or individuals who run, freelance companies. Like myself, I'm a grant writer. I'm a fundraising consultant. So sometimes I may be a partner for a nonprofit that's hoping to carry out their mission. So that's a pretty important part of this process. And then lastly, what I would argue is one of the most important parts of creating your project and identifying the work that you're doing is its impact. So by program impact is, what is the most important part of the work that you're doing? How is it going to impact the communities that you're in? And also, how is it different than other things that may exist or similar services or initiatives that exist already? So program impact is really important to, specify and identify for the work you're doing. And so I'm going to take a quick moment before I move on to the creative budget. If people have questions or if they want to send Brianna a quick message, I'm just going to take a moment for folks to kind of process the information I've been providing the webinar so far, and maybe take a few moments to jot down some information. Okay. All right, so moving on, the next step, once you've identified that program, that initiative, and you've specified all those elements of that pyramid, moving on to the budget. And this, I think, is the core of the work that you're going to do. It's understanding how much it will cost to carry out your vision, to carry out the initiative that you have in mind. And first, you need to think about what type of money you need or what type of funding you need. And that's really important based on the work that you're doing. Are you a new business or a new nonprofit or a new company and you need seed money or Kickstarter money? And there are definitely a number of companies and small foundations and government grant opportunities who specifically carve out money to help you start your initiative, to help you start your program. Or if you are a company or a nonprofit especially, a common term in the fundraising grant writing world is general operational funding or general operations. And that is funding that is for general use for whatever your organization is doing. However, sometimes funders may specify what that money is, and it comes in two types: unrestricted and restricted. So unrestricted general operational or general operations funding is money that you can use for any use. So that could be staff salaries, program materials or supplies, or transportation, overhead costs, things that just come up as you're launching your initiative. That is what unrestricted funding is for. Restricted funding, however, is obviously restricted means limited. So a funder may specify, oh, you know what, I can give you this money, but only use it for your program. So you can't use it to cover your, internet or utility costs for your organization, but only for the initiative you're doing, and maybe a couple of people who are helping you carry out that initiative. And then there are a couple other types of funding I'll just mention. Capital is very, very common, and capital is commonly understood as construction or building funding. So if you need to open a new store, open a new business chapter, or duplicate your nonprofit somewhere, capital funding is what you will need to get that started. It is the funding specifically used for the construction of the physical building, the physical site. And then there's research and small business grants, which are very unique and separate from the other types of funding I've listed, in that research grants can be very specific to science or sociology or psychology, specific opportunities to research elements of society, and those grants come from the government as well, from foundations, all sources. And small business grants, very similar. They're very tailored, very unique, and sometimes can stem from corporations if they have, small business competitions. There are tons of initiatives that exist in the world where you can apply for very specific funding to start a small business. So, understanding the different types of money. Then you need to specify, okay, I know what type of funding I need, what type of money I need, but how long do I need it for? And so distinguishing short-term versus long-term is a great way to think about this. Do you need funding for maybe 6 months to anywhere to 3 years? That, in my mind, as a grant writer and my background, is more or less short-term. Long-term is anywhere from 3 to 10 years, especially if you're just starting a new organization and need security and long-term funding. So distinguishing short and long-term is your next step once you've identified the type of funding you need. And the next step is creating a budget. And this, of course, is very helpful if you have a financial advisor, if you're working in a company or a nonprofit. It's very helpful to have a person or two in that field to assist you in writing it. But if this is an opportunity for you to create new skills or to learn what it's like to just create a budget and you're doing this on your own, then here are my pieces of advice for creating that budget. It's definitely helpful to think about your revenue and your expenses, the kind of top and bottom that create a budget. What money are you bringing in from either the services you're providing or the fundraising that you're doing? And then expenses, what does it cost to do what you want to do? So those are the two most important elements of your budget. And then, of course, the also grant writing lingo that I'll add here is the time frame of your budget, kind of the bookends of your budget. And for businesses, they use calendar years, which, just like it sounds, is January to December. As myself as an LLC, my forms, my financials will be on a calendar year. However, for nonprofits, very common to hear the term fiscal year, which technically in grant writing terms will be from July of one year to June of the following year. And so that'll be a fiscal year. And a lot of fundraising initiatives work on that fiscal calendar, especially nonprofits. So a lot of information about budgets. I thought it would be helpful to look at a sample. So we're going to take a look here at an example of what a sample organizational budget looks like. So this is a sample budget, and I'll just take a minute to kind of scroll through it. And you can take a look to see, all right, they've identified the income or revenue for their budget. And they've identified, this is a nonprofit, I should have mentioned, it's a nonprofit organization's organizational budget. So they've identified their funding sources. And also, as you can see, the FY17, that refers to, again, that fiscal year 17. So this will be from July of 2016 to June of 2017, because it's the ending of the fiscal year is 2017. So they've identified where they're going to receive financial support. So it'll be from individual donations, and they have a board, so their board will be contributing. They will also have contributions from corporations, maybe some foundation grants, maybe government support, and from the numbers, it looks like that's a big percentage of their income, of their revenue. And then they have some local government contracts. That may be from a city council or from a local representative that supports what they do. So that's what the local government contracts is. And then maybe some special events, specific fundraisers that maybe their board does, or some volunteers who are really passionate about their organization. That's the special events portion. And then moving down, they've listed very clearly their expenses. What will it cost? The salaries, fringe, consultants, intern stipends, that as a good group, personnel services. It's a great, small section that is very common in nonprofit budgets. Those are the very important line items to identify. How much will it cost to have staff? Fringe is, additional costs, consultants, outside, perspective and assistance, and then interns to assist with their programs. And then a list of, OTPS, other than personal services. And you can see a list of expenses here. And, this may not be everything depending on the work that you're doing, but good examples of utilities, rental, office supplies, travel, insurance, very common expenses. So taking a look at this budget, this is, one organizational budget. And of course, yours may look different depending on what you're funding. I thought it'd be a good opportunity to just see what it looks like. And now moving forward, measurable objectives. So you have identified your project, the need, who you're going to serve, and then you have identified or created your budget. What will it cost to do what you want to do and to carry out your vision? However, for funders, it's also very important to identify your impact, like the bottom of that blue pyramid, right? So measurable objectives or measurable outcomes are very important for any grant proposal. So it's important before you write that grant to identify what those areas are. And kind of starting with that first, quantitative measures. And the most common quantitative measure that I hear from grant writing is number of clients served or individuals served. can be very simple. How many students are taking your class, or how many individuals are enrolling in job programs. It can just be the number of people. But using that example of individuals who've received jobs, that can turn into a very program-specific metric, something like the number of jobs secured. So not just the people, but the jobs that they secured, or maybe degrees obtained. If you are a school or you have a educational course, how many individuals are obtaining degrees at completion. Maybe you are an environmental organization or nonprofit, and you're tracking, reusable energy. How much energy are individuals conserving? And maybe that's a very specific metric. Or if you work at a justice organization, a social impact organization, maybe you are taking on cases, and so how many briefs have been filed? So thinking of something very specific to your work, that can be very compelling and also a clear way to distinguish your impact. And then moving on to something a little bit more creative, something more qualitative. So I like to think of this as taking the form of surveys or case studies. So maybe for some nonprofits and companies, the impact you're measuring is how perceptions have shifted. And for some organizations, that can sound like their understanding of their educational achievement, or maybe another example, mental health and wellness. Your organization, your nonprofit, your business can be tracking, well, are individuals using our services or enrolled in our program, are they, less stressed? Are they more focused? Are they more energized? Different metrics like that. Or are their relationships improved, whether it's with family members or with employers? So a different way of still measuring impact, but something that's a little bit more creative, using language to articulate clearly the individuals that you're serving and how they've been impacted. And then like the cherry on top of your measurable objectives, from my experience, is to always contextualize your outcomes with time. So for example, using the job employment program, say a nonprofit has that, very specific measurable objectives can sound like, we will employ 1,500 clients by December 2021, and then 3,500, 3,500 by December 2023. So no matter what your program is doing and what impact you're having, it's very important to also, for your work, identify the specific number of individuals you're going to serve, and then tie that to time. Okay, so moving into phase 2, I think this is probably one of the most important parts, to identify how and where you can find grants. And I know this is one part of grant writing and fundraising that can be very challenging. And people always wonder, where can I find funding, or, how can I do that? So I thought it was very important for this webinar to really clearly and also, creatively show what that looks like and how you can do that. Okay. So as silly as it sounds, it's very easy to just start with your grant, writing process, or your prospect researching process. Process is what I call it. Beginning the prospect funder search with just a basic Google search. And I think some people may already know that. But for prospect researching, the process of looking for grants, a basic Google search could really be a great start to your grant search. And some search criteria that I find is very helpful, kind of going down these bullets, starting off with, in your Google search, the focus area. Is it, youth development or youth services, for example? That's a very specific but broad focus area. So starting with that term in your search first. Then following that with the location. So where is your work currently? Or where are you going to serve your program? Is it New York City? Okay, great. Use that as the next term in your search. Then moving on to funding type, just as we were talking about earlier. Do you need capital funding, or do you need program funding? Whatever it is, let's say in this case, program support or program funding, put that right in there. And even use the terms grant or funding in the search itself. And then I always like to add application. So program grant application, because then your Google search is not only finding the grant, but also the thing to apply for, the application itself. And when you're doing these searches, this second side of this slide to look out for, I've listed a couple of bullets, and I'll just, briefly go through them. It's helpful to understand when you're doing your search, or maybe not understand, just observe the type of funders that pop up. So are you seeing .gov, or are you seeing foundation? Start to kind of observe, what funders are coming up when you do your searches. And then see if maybe in the search it's tied to a website. Is it going directly to a certain government department, or is it going straight to a foundation? And then once you kind of see, oh, who is it and is their website linked, then the areas of interest that you notice under that funder. Okay, so say you go to that foundation's website, oh, well, what do they fund? Looking more at their areas of interest and seeing if it aligns with yours. In grant writing terms, it's called philanthropic alignment, very common term as well. Is this funder that I'm looking at, does their work align with the needs that I need to meet with funding? And then, of course, looking at their geographic focus, the populations they're interested in serving, and then the types of funding that they give out. So those are just a few, of course, things to look for. But to give an example of what this looks like, let's actually try out a search. So we're going to go to Google here. And I've already pulled up a copy and paste of what was on the slide, Youth Services NYC Program Grant Application. Just as an example, well, what does it look like? So here you see a couple of examples. See a .gov, which indicates that this is a government branch, an opportunity that has government funding. And you can see, DYCD is very common, Department of Youth and Community Development. A lot of nonprofits that serve youth receive funding from DYCD. So if you are, a New York City-based youth services program, that could be a great funding opportunity. Or moving down the searches, you may see foundation. Now, from my personal grant experiences, the Willing to Grant Foundation is an excellent funder, and you start to see, all right, they clearly have great grant opportunities, who serve children and youth in New York City. Starting to look at the language, you may notice, all right, this could be also a great grant opportunity. And maybe you continue to move down the page and see other potential funders. But a Google search is just a great opportunity to start your grant prospect research and just get a sense initially of what funders are out there who may fund what you do. All right. So I'm also just going to take a moment before I dive into this slide right here for folks to take some notes, maybe send some questions to Brianna, and just process some information. I know this is quite a lot, especially if some of this information is new for some of you. And for any of you who this is very familiar information, some questions may be coming up. So just giving folks a couple of seconds or two to jot down some questions or jot down some comments, send them to Brianna.
There's one question, wondering where you would include metrics.
Okay, wondering where you would include metrics. So I think that question may be answered in a couple of slides as I present a grant application sample, and I can show you where metrics are in that grant proposal. If that person has any other questions, let me know. Happy to clarify that.
And then another one, just to kind of give you a break for a minute from presenting.
Sure.
How do you keep up with philanthropic trends that inform your grant writing language? And what practices do you do to strengthen your grant writing?
That's an excellent question. So later on, I'll mention a couple of, and even on this page, a couple of sites where you can sign up for email alerts for grant opportunities. The most common one I'm going to mention is the Philanthropic News Digest. It's a online source where you can just sign up for email alerts for funding opportunities, news in the grant world. It's an excellent resource, and really you just sign up for email. So that's one I'll mention in a couple of minutes. And if you want to, look up on your computer during the webinar, feel free to do that. And in terms of staying up to date on language, those email alerts certainly help. But it's also really helpful to look at the resources through Candid, which I'll also mention in a couple of minutes. Candid is a great online database. It's finally kind of centralized all of these different databases where you can take grant writing tutorials or grant writing workshops, especially if you're at a nonprofit and want to sharpen your grant writing skills. They offer tutorials and trainings. So Candid is a great resource for some of that professional development that I'll mention later. All right, any other questions, or how are we doing?
Perfect. Yes, and I just had a question about Sophie so her presentation will be available on our website. I am recording it, but I don't know, Sophie, are you going to be sharing it out if someone wanted a copy of it? Would you be willing to share it, or?
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone shoots you an email and says, "Hey, can I get a PDF copy?" I'm happy to send it over.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. We are good for now. So go ahead.
Okay, great. All right. So this big databases page. So now that you've kind of done your research, you've been going through the Google searches and you're starting to see things coming up, I'd like to kind of take a moment to look at the wealth of research engines and databases that exist for you to research grants. And as you may notice, and I hope this is not too much of a distraction, but I, for a disclaimer, included these little asterisks just to specify that you can absolutely go to these research engines and databases, but some of them will request or require you to, purchase a subscription or do a demo before you look at the search engine. So just as a disclaimer, some of those like iWave right here, or Wealth Engine, or Relationship Science, those three especially will require like demos or previews. And I'll kind of mention those just initially because they are very helpful, but they're most commonly used at organizations. They'll usually have some type of subscription. So just as a disclaimer, kind of mention those at first. But the ones that are more accessible for kind of basically the everyday human, searching for their grant writing opportunities or just their funding opportunities. Starting from left to right with government grants, grants.gov is public, it is accessible, and it is probably one of my favorite, databases to utilize because there can be such specific funding opportunities through the government. And of course, as we're seeing now, the government is trying to be strategic in terms of how it's going to support local economies, medical professionals, individuals who are essential workers. So the government has a lot of money, and grants.gov is an excellent resource. And also in this presentation, I've included links to every one of these. So in the presentation, you can just click and visit the pages. And I'll do that actually for a couple of these while we're here on this webinar. And then next for government grants, just to quickly mention, GrantWatch and GrantScape are excellent funding resources. GrantScape may be a little bit more limited in your search. GrantWatch is a little bit more liberal in your search opportunities, depending on if you have, fiscally the ability to purchase, an X dollar a month subscription, you'll get more information from your searches. So not only the grant application information or the deadline or the funding area or the amount, but you may get who the funder is, or maybe a link to the exact grant application. You'll really get more information that you really need. So those are some government grant opportunities. Moving to foundations, FDO or Foundation Directory Online is by far the most popular funding research engine that I know from my fundraising experience. It is used very frequently by fundraising professionals and grant writers because it's just a very reliable search engine, and you may not need that subscription to do the search. So because this is such a popular search engine, I'm just going to open it here and give you guys a brief kind of overview of what it looks like. So because I'm a fundraising consultant, I have a special account with FDO, but it helps to just do a quick search. So my favorite part about Foundation Directory Online is the advanced search and filters section. So once you come to this page, no matter what level of subscription you have, that feature is always there. Take a quick click, and then you see all of these opportunities to fill in information to tailor down your funding search. So say, for example, your subject area, moving back to the example we used before, let's say it's, human services, and maybe you're looking for youth development. Let's try that. And then your geographic focus, right, In the Google search example I used, I said New York City. So we'll just put New York, let's see, New York City. All right, so New York City comes up, we'll click that. And then population served, we'll just go to age groups and select children and youth. So already you have 3 great areas you've identified, based on your work. And we're just gonna click search and just see what comes up. All right, so as you scroll down a little bit, you see that there are 100 grant makers that come up. And there's a wealth of information that FDO provides for you. It reiterates the city and state where the foundation is located. And for some, it might not be New York City, but that still is helpful information to know. And then you'll see some fiscal information, which is also insightful to know as you're looking deeper into grant opportunities, because you start to identify how much money does this foundation have, and that's very closely tied to how much money can it give. So this information is also very important to know just as you're continuing your funding research or your prospect research. All right. So this is FDO, and thought it'd be just a good opportunity to see what it looks like. I'm going to hop back to the presentation and check out these small businesses. So actually, before I continue on to small businesses, just to quickly get back to iWave. iWave is an excellent search engine, again, for more organizations if you're looking for more detailed information. So iWave can provide anything from political contributions to giving histories for companies, for foundations, that can be a little bit more detailed sometimes than FDO. So small businesses and individuals, to briefly mention this side, because I know it's maybe not as popular, but if you are even a college student or someone thinking of starting a business, or you're an employer or someone working at a nonprofit and you want to know more about an individual and their giving capacity, these 5 resources are excellent to use. The first, also by Candid, is called Grants to Individuals. I would highly recommend this specific resource. Then GrantWatch, again, universally helpful tool. And then within GrantWatch is something called MWBE Zone, which is a business-specific research engine. And then lastly, these 2, which I mentioned before, little disclaimer about their opportunity, to do databases and work like that. These are more about individual net worth, investments, personal information. If you're looking for detailed information about a specific person and how that individual could support your work, could give you a grant or could just provide, seed funding for your work, these research engines are very helpful for that. Okay, so you may have identified some potential funders. So now you need to look at the person you need to contact. And this is by far, one of my favorite parts of the process, because, you've done your research and sometimes that can be really challenging to find the right fit, but then you get to have some fun in finding the right person. So sometimes it's just as simple as going to a foundation or a funder's website, or looking at their staff directory if it's available on their website. And the persons that I tend to look for are any individual that's a director of development, someone who is a senior level person, or if that title isn't available and maybe their organization, their foundation is very small. Typically with foundations or donor advised funds, as I mentioned earlier, you may need to find someone who has like fiscal manager in their title or grants manager in their title. But as senior as possible is always helpful to find. And sometimes it's as easy as going on LinkedIn and doing a search for their foundation staff. Sometimes I find that helpful. If I can't seem to find a staff person on a foundation's website, I'll go to LinkedIn, type in the name of the foundation, and see if a staff person's name comes up. And then I'll look at their title to see, okay, they're a director of grantees or a director of programs. Somebody with that title could be helpful to look at. And then in addition, one of my favorite kind of unknown secrets sometimes in grant writing is going to GuideStar. And I'll definitely click the link to GuideStar here to show you what I mean by that. So GuideStar is a search engine also available where you can look at 990s, which are the fiscal forms for nonprofits, or the 990 PFs for private foundations. And you can research through GuideStar, also provided through Candid, where companies give money to and also where nonprofits receive funding from. So GuideStar can be an excellent, clever resource for not only, your prospect research, but then finding contacts. Because sometimes foundations may be really private and they may not list who manages, grantees. This is an excellent resource. So just wanted to kind of mention that here. And then lastly, as I mentioned, iWave, great resource. Finding specific contact information, iWave can definitely provide as close to an email or phone number for a person. So especially for organizations, great tool to have. And then lastly, just including kind of the process of reaching out to funders. I always find it helpful to start with a phone call because it really shows that you're trying to make that personal connection, speaking to someone on the phone and just getting to know somebody, once you found that person and, found a phone number. But if a phone number isn't an option, always finding an email is helpful, sending a very personal note. And of course, if that isn't an option, going to a contact us page or again, using that LinkedIn connection can also be very helpful. And then a couple brief notes in terms of the type of communication. So how should you introduce yourself? What are some important, key things to include? So I would first start off with a brief introduction. And it can be as simple as, hi, my name is Sophie Halter. I am a grant writer for Feeding America. And I'm reaching out to the X Foundation because your work with hunger and food insecurity aligns really well with our background in serving communities in need and providing food access. I would love to connect with you, maybe schedule a call sometime. Can you let me know when you're available? So hitting those 3 bullet points of a brief introduction about yourself, more about your organization and how it connects to the funder you're reaching out to, and then really inviting them in the message to connect. And maybe that is a phone call if that's, an option for them. But, including language, requesting availability, that specifically can be really helpful to include. All right, so here we are. We're kind of at the final phase of this process. And in my perspective, the grant writing is the prospect researching can be the hardest part, finding the right funders. It can also be difficult to just identify your project, right? The very first phase and getting that information very clear in front of you so you know your work, who you're serving, and the impact that you want to have. Those 2 phases can be pretty tricky. And this 3rd phase, in my opinion, is where you get to really kind of brag about your work and write a really solid grant proposal that convinces a funder that they should support what you do. And if grant writing is really new to you and it's just, a new term and this whole idea of grant writing is just very new, my advice is that grant writing can be an excellent opportunity to exercise any experience you have with persuasive writing or research experience that you have, using data and using information to persuade and compel someone to believe in a certain fact or to believe in a cause. So no matter kind of where you are on that spectrum, I think grant writing is a really important skill, and I'm going to kind of walk slowly through in some parts the key elements of a grant proposal. So we'll get to that in just a minute. So first, starting off with, let's say you found your funder. Noting what proposals are available to you, what grant application opportunities are available to you. And first, just starting with the most common form of grant applications, a letter of inquiry or interest, frequently called an LOI. And some foundations or private organizations or even corporations that have a philanthropic arm. For example, let's say the Wells Fargo Foundation, they may have an LOI. And this basically is an introduction that you're giving of your organization and your work to that potential funder. And some of them may be online resources. So here's one example that I'd like to share with you guys. This is the Tiger Foundation, and they're focused in providing funding for breaking the cycle of poverty in New York City. And this is a great example of an LOI because on their tab, How to Apply, you scroll down slowly, you'll see this box that says Start a New Letter of Inquiry. And it's just really helpful to see that some foundations, make it really clearly that that is the first, kind of the first stop in your journey with them. Submitting a letter of inquiry is, again, an introduction for a funder to say, oh, I'm really interested in so-and-so's work. I like this letter of inquiry. I may ask them to submit a full grant proposal. And some, however, take a different route. Instead of an LOI, they may want to know first if you are eligible for their funding opportunities. And that's typically in the form of an eligibility quiz. And there are some specific kind of qualifications, like, are you a 501c3? Do you serve individuals in this area of the country? So the eligibility quiz is kind of an alternative, in my eyes, of an LOI. And here is another example that I'd like to provide you all of what an eligibility quiz may look like. This is the TD Charitable Foundation. So we all know TD Bank, a very popular nationwide bank. They start off with immediately the question of, does your organization provide services in any of these counties? So they're very specific, asking you right up front, does your work come out of these areas? And they'll tell you more, yes or no, and not to kind of go through the process right now, but just showing you that some charitable foundations or foundations in general may use this as a tactic. And then for other potential funders, they may just have an online application, which is the most common in my eyes of applications. And it is very easy for individuals looking for funding because they can go online. And if there's no registration, it's very helpful to just start the process of writing your grant through that. And sometimes there may be an open call on a foundation's website. In other words, if you're able to go to the website and see under their funding areas, oh, there's an opportunity to fund. Excellent. I'll reply to this open call. And some are invitation to apply only. So for some foundations, they're so private that they only are going to request very specific organizations that they support to apply for their funding. And sometimes it's a little bit harder to identify who those foundations are. It takes some deeper prospect research to find out who they are. But then that's where that relationship development comes into play. And then one of my favorite opportunities, which is not only common like online applications, but is most commonly used and tapped into, are requests for proposals. So requests for proposals are excellent in that you can receive email alerts, as I mentioned earlier, when opportunities for funding are released. And so what I'll show, for example, just really briefly, a sample request for proposal is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they're a very large foundation, very well known, but they also can be very particular about who they give money to. So here they have requests for proposals. And here's an example, this Grand Challenges Grant Opportunities. Now you'll have to kind of see, is the RFP or the request for proposal still open? Are they still giving grants? Is there still an application? So if you click, and you'll see, oh, you know what? There aren't any grant opportunities at this time, but they have a couple websites, their main website and the specific grant opportunity website, where you can still stay up to date. So I find that RFPs can be very helpful for looking at grant opportunities. All right, and then to kind of wind this process down before we, seal up this webinar and conclude the webinar, I wanted to kind of break down and then show a sample of what's included in a grant proposal, starting with the mission statement of your organization. What is it that you do? Maybe the day that you were founded, the year that you were founded, starting off very briefly with that information. So a good example may be, this is the youth development works or something like that. This is a hypothetical name. And our focus is to serve young people, ages 13 to 18 in their educational, professional, job skill development, really specifying what you do. And then an organization summary or a history. typically a paragraph or so, and that may also include, a founded in year, when you were founded or how your organization came to be, and maybe including the individuals who started your organization, who started the work that you do. So that history can be a great follow-up after your mission statement. It contextualizes who you are and where you came from, where your work came from. And then the funding request. And as I discussed earlier in the budget, this is where that really ties back into. As part of this, grant writer's dozen, the overview of your funding request is simply how much money you need, how long you need the funding for, and then the areas that funding will cover. And it can be a simple paragraph, or it can be broken down into really those 3 bullet points. And then next up, the narrative part. So while the overview may be more numerical, or the area of focus can certainly be listing, like youth employment or youth education, keeping that really brief. Your narrative is where you bring back the statement of need, right? Revisiting that pyramid. What is the need you are meeting? And then describing your program. What is the program you've designed to address that need? And then how will you carry out that program over time? So this is where you get to be really compelling and really creative with your writing and show the funder, that your program is important, that's necessary, and that it has a very unique purpose in society. And then it's helpful to follow up with demographics. So going back to, again, that target population, though it's kind of different in this structure than in the pyramid, but getting back to the target population, who are you serving? Dedicating a part of your grant application to actual data, the percentage of individuals of different identity. So maybe look at gender or race or age. Who are you serving? And then including staff and leadership, getting back to who are the individuals who are helping you in this process, who are the key players in carrying out your program. And then that follows right back into the evidence of impact. So you get to really use those measurable outcomes, that I was talking about earlier. And again, making those compelling, saying, through our, youth services or youth development program, we are going to serve 1,000 young people in a 6-month time span. And we are going to help, 500 of them secure internships. We hope maybe 250 enroll in this job skill training program that we have. That's where you get to take from your narrative, talking about your target population, to then identify the impact you're going to have and listing those outcomes. And then again, getting back into your leadership, sometimes funders want to know who is in your leadership, because sometimes the individuals running your programs and carrying out your mission can be really helpful, that the leadership reflects the individuals you serve. And sometimes, ethically, that can be a really strong selling point for a funder. And then, of course, financials, a very important part, and not to get too into detail right now, but no matter if you're a company or employee of a nonprofit or company even, financials will be very helpful to include in the application itself. So again, going back to the organizational budget, how much does it cost to run your organization? And if you're applying for a specific program, including how much will it cost to run this initiative and listing that amount. And then especially for nonprofits, listing funding sources. So going back to the budget example I provided, that could be, we receive donations from individuals, from foundations, from government, any number of sources. It's important to list those, and especially how much or what percentage of your revenue comes from those different funding sources. And then coming to the tail end, right? Projections can be something that foundations ask for in grant applications, as well as a couple other questions. And I'd like to just leave them here as thoughts for grant writing. Some grant applications include questions like projections, thinking of your future impact, and the impact of the funding you may receive, tied to sustainability. So how sustainable is the work that you're doing? What things do you have in place to sustain your work? And then that ending with philanthropic alignment, a term that I mentioned earlier, which is how does the work that you do closely tie to the funder you're applying to their grant application. So let's say, for example, the Tiger Foundation, their work is with the cycle of poverty. If you're submitting a grant to them, is the work that you're doing, really tied to their philanthropic interest? And then in your grant, making the case for that. And then, of course, a compelling conclusion, always an essential part of a grant application. It's really like the bow tie, the ribbon on this grant application present. What is a funder going to remember as the last, narrative part of your grant application? What can you say about your work that makes you unique, one of a kind, different? What stands out about your work, and why is this particular funder a great fit for you? And then, of course, the boring old, end of the grant application attachments, just kind of including here. It's always important to, have the documentation for your organization, whether that's legal information, board information, financial information. It's always a part of a grant application and can be, tedious in uploading documents, but it's always essential to include. All right. So summing up this webinar, I thought we would end with just taking a look at a sample grant application. All right, and so I've kind of blacked out some areas of this just to preserve the confidentiality of the grant proposal. This is a grant that I personally wrote. So I just thought I would take a minute or two, after having all this conversation about, funding and grant writing, just to see what it looks like. And so I'll just kind of slowly move down the page and see the certain sections. So this particular grant application, I've included in the beginning, the request for support that we've mentioned earlier, and then a little bit of organizational background, understanding the funders, understanding their history, and then target population, including some data about the individuals served, some information about program support, and then some of the key elements of their program, really. So getting down to the nitty-gritty information about the work that they do. And then some unique parts of grant applications will maybe ask you for program evaluation. So sometimes it's helpful to include a bit about how your work is evaluated, how you rethink and go back to the effectiveness of your work, and measurable outcomes. How will this program be effective? So, right, this is the part where you include those program outcomes. Evidence of organizational effectiveness. So, including some studies and maybe research that show how impactful your work is. And then maybe including a page or two about staff. And then wrapping it up with, of course, your compelling conclusion and some proposal attachments. This is just, a sample of what a grant may look like. And, every grant application looks different. This is something that I wrote, in collaboration with other staff to really make this grant cohesive and effective, but just a sample. All right. And then, of course, I will definitely send this to Brianna so she can send this to folks who are interested in learning more about professional development opportunities. I'd mentioned kind of throughout the webinar these links. So Candid, Grant Space, Philanthropy News Digest, really excellent resources. Definitely would encourage everyone interested or even just curious about grant writing to visit these links and to take a look into the webinars or trainings they offer, and to take a deeper dive if you're curious. And so having said that, though, I'm sure you all may be able to answer this question, but why do we need grant writers? Why are they, essential to our society? And my answer to this question is, grant writers understand who uses money to address which social issues, where, when, and why, and how those decisions impact our communities. And it's, I think grant writers sometimes are really understated, but they're kind of the key nuts and bolts to understanding all of these, intersectional causes, whether that may be social justice and funding, but they're just really essential to understanding really how our society works and how money goes from one place to the next. And so having said that, I realize I'm just about a minute or two over 6, but I wanted to kind of say thank you all. I'm sure that was a wealth of information, new or familiar to many, but just wanted to say thank you and maybe leave a couple minutes for some questions if possible.
Perfect. Thank you, Sophie. Okay, we have 2 questions that have come in. The first is, when you connect with the individuals, as you pointed out in the one slide, what types of questions do you ask when you connect with them in order to build that relationship?
That's an excellent question. So maybe using the Tiger Foundation example I used earlier, that they serve nonprofits who work to break the cycle of poverty. So a question, let's say I'm talking to the director of programs at the Tiger Foundation. Some questions that I may ask them may be, do you have any specific initiatives towards breaking the cycle of poverty? Because that's a really broad area, and different nonprofits address poverty and address maybe like job insecurity or homelessness, a lot of subsets of that issue. So sometimes they may have specific initiatives where your nonprofit's work may fit in that niche. So I sometimes ask, oh, do you have any like unique funding opportunities going on right now? And on the flip side of that, I also ask, what are your current funding areas? It may be that while the cycle of poverty and breaking that cycle is typically what they fund, especially nowadays, funding priorities may have shifted. So while I may ask, oh, do you have any unique funding opportunities or unique initiatives going on? I may also ask, have your priorities shifted? Because it kind of helps you and the funder understand, would this be a good match? And I think in addition to those 2 questions, my final question to ask them would be their timeline for funding. Some funders are private and they don't advertise their funding opportunities. So, this grant application is due, June 1st. It's always kind of helpful to say, hey, could you remind us again of, when your funding timelines are, when your grant applications are available? Those are definitely helpful questions to ask.
Perfect. And then the other question was from someone currently working with a nonprofit who is wondering how grant writing might shift during the era of COVID. Do you think this space will become more competitive? And how will grant writing lead in ensuring funding or nonprofits during these times?
That's an excellent question. And some of my consulting already, I have started to see that shift. Some funders are, as I kind of used to answer that first question, they are shifting their funding priorities. And some are advertising on their website. I think there was a brief snippet on the Tiger Foundation about that. I kind of glanced and saw like COVID-19 somewhere. In terms of funding, in terms of it being competitive, yes, it's definitely going to be more competitive as funders start to shift their priorities. And I'm starting to notice from conversations with funders that it's really any funding area. So I know some funders who typically fund, workforce development, that may be like job readiness, employment programs. They're funding nursing homes and, individuals who are in nursing homes, who receive specific medical care. They've completely shifted their funding areas. So shifting in funding areas, definitely noticing, more competitive, definitely noticing. With the actual grant writing process and narrative-wise, I've started to see funders making it more accessible. So I would definitely encourage everyone on the webinar, especially if you're at a nonprofit, to utilize, Candid, GrantSpace, and the Philanthropy News Digest, because they're starting to release COVID-19 specific news alerts. And even if you don't want to receive the news alerts, you can start to see the increase in availability and funding opportunities. I'm starting already to see it, and it's, every day, multiple notifications. So definitely noticing those 3 trends so far.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sophie, for your time tonight. And like I said, this has been recorded, so it will be shared up on our Career Services webpage as a resource. And then if anybody wants to get in touch with Sophie following the session, please just reach out to me and I will be happy to share her email address with you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Brianna. Thank you so much, everyone who's been on the webinar.
Awesome. Have a good night,
Thank
Sophie.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
So much. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
You're welcome.